the timelines for renewal are several months in advance that we're starting. And so we're putting out 100 renewals to all of these tenants. The law change comes in and it's retroactive.
Right.
So we need to come back and redo all of those executed renewals.
I think it can be a shock that certain things have worn out over 1 to 5 years, however long you might have that tenant, but it does not mean that a remodel is the burden of the tenant. Tenants are very well protected against that.
Hello and welcome to the SJA Podcast. I'm here with Duncan Murphy, who is our Director of Operations here at SJA Property Management. And today we're going to talk about self-managing properties, sort of the ins and outs of that, how to do it successfully, some of the pitfalls that we see with landlords, and really just go over what it takes to be a successful self-managing landlord. And if you're evaluating as maybe a new investor or someone's thinking about what's the best way to hold your real estate, do I go with professional management? Do I self-manage? What makes sense for you? Hopefully we can provide some insights as to the best path forward. So Duncan, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Excited to come on. I appreciate you having me join the podcast. And yeah, great topic to discuss today. As we know, things just change so quickly in the Washington and Seattle area. So definitely some great tips and tricks and some education to come.
No, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just changing so rapidly. And as a couple of the notes that I had written down is it was a lot easier to self-manage 10 years ago. And it seems to be ratcheting up, year after year. I remember I grew up and my dad had rentals and we managed them as a family. So he would have farm leases and he would do all the move-ins and all the move-outs. And it was fairly simple for him to have a small portfolio and do it well and also have a full-time, job. Now I'm looking at all the rules and regulations that we deal with, you and I and everyone here at SJA on a regular basis, and how we're having to adapt. And I'm going, wow, this could be arduous for some owners who aren't educated. And so hopefully we can provide some insights to help everyone get a better understanding of what's necessary in order to be successful. So I just love to start out with, what still works with what are some tried and true things that self-managers need to know, or what's work that they make sure that they're doing in order to be successful right now. And then we can jump into some of the pitfalls and things we need to be looking out for. So what's working right now for self-managers?
Yeah, certainly somebody to me who is maybe it's their first entry into owning and renting an investment property. What works great is if you can be very hands-on, right? And you can control and have a certain level of comfort with what's happening at your property. So first and foremost, I think people when they begin to want to rent out their property, they think, well, how am I going to find a tenant? Right. And that's so important because an investment property without a tenant isn't a great investment. That's a liability. So really and truly, I think what works well is if you are comfortable with handling all of those showings at your property, meeting your candidates there, asking for documentation and application information that you are comfortable with owning essentially the outcome of that application. My recommendation there is you do your homework well ahead of when those showings begin or when you're listing your property. So very important, no matter where you are, is to understand what's allowable in an application and the criteria with which you screen an applicant. So obviously protected classes are something that you need to be very aware of. And then what you can and cannot ask for throughout the application process, definitely worth being well aware of those items. And my recommendation is be very rigid with your criteria. Oftentimes, and this happens in any situation, but a prospect or an applicant, they have a story, they have a background, they have a reason as to why, their criteria might not be a great fit. So be comfortable. This is where you can really control your risk, is how do you underwrite, screen, and approve or decline those applicants. So I think that's a great point where if you're very, nearby and hands-on with your property, you can certainly get that done and get that done well to
Mhm.
find your tenant.
Yeah.
And then I think simple maintenance. I think somebody who wants to self-manage, I think to find, to vet one vendor who you want to go to for all things, if a cabinet is off its hinge or a toilet is stopped up. Somebody you can call and and you trust, and they can go there quickly. I still think that's a great option for self managers.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what I hear you saying is definitely making sure that you're educated. And when I see people that are evaluating whether they want to self-manage or they want to do it themselves, my first thought is, are you willing to get educated on everything associated with the legal ramifications of managing property? And that is a choice, and one that you have to do your homework. You can get a lot of this online now using chat, having various forums, and looking at the codes of Washington, things like that. But you want to be really to speed in what's allowed and what's not. And you pointed on one of the biggest pitfalls that owners can get into, and that is the initial screening process. In Washington State specifically, even more so in Seattle, that is highly regulated. And if violations and fines can be steep, they can lead to lawsuits if done incorrectly. And it's not always intuitive. So, what you think you might be able to do and what you're allowed to do are often different. And that's an education process for some of our owners. And definitely, if you're self managing, you want to make sure you really understand that and you have a specific process that you're using that is not biased, that follows all the rules and treats everyone equally. Making sure you have that. And what you said that also really resonated with me was, people do have a story and they have real life circumstances as to why their qualifications are a certain way. And that is when you become a landlord, you are now committing to running a small business. And that small business, you need to make sure you have your standards, and you're not going on personal gut feel. You're not making exceptions to your standards, because that's where we see landlords get in big trouble. So making sure you have standards, you apply them equally to everyone, and starting out on a good foot is so important. So just to recap, making sure you're educated on the beginning stages of what's necessary in order to get a tenant in here and get them set up legally, and making sure that you're doing some continuing education on what's required as a landlord in order for me to stay in compliance. So important there. And you did talk about maintenance as well. And I think of that as having a go-to team that you can go to for various things that are going on in that property, so that you're not scrambling when something does happen and now you're not meeting the required timelines that Washington State has for certain repairs. And there is a set of timelines that landlords must meet for certain repairs. And the ones that are, have to do with health and safety, those timelines are very short, and other ones are a little bit more spread out there. But making sure that you have a stable of people that you can trust, that are licensed, insured, have been properly vetted to go into your property, and you have a good relationship with them.
Yeah.
I do see that, some landlords will say, well, I know a guy, I have a person, I have someone I've met off Craigslist, or my cousin's very handy and all of this. And I think it's important to understand that when you are a landlord, you're held to a higher standard. Now someone else is living in your property. So you are required as a landlord to make sure that you've properly screened whatever vendor that you send into your property, to make sure that they are licensed, they are insured, and because now it's an occupied property. And if you don't, you can be held liable for any work that they do there. So really important to have a good, stable maintenance crew, as you would say, but sometimes that's going to be different companies depending on the licensing requirements of the work, but having that for sure. Another one is, documentation and all of the documents that you need to have signed. So what do you think about that? What's a way for someone to help stay in compliance with all of those form changes and things like that?
Yeah, you mentioned it. RCW, I would say, is so very important. And I would say investment property has, in the recent 5 to 10 years, has become much more tech enabled. So there are certainly off the shelf options for help with screening applicants and doing it based on the state that your property is in. So a part of documentation, a lot of those will come with template or boilerplate items that you can use. I would still recommend don't take it for surface value, and to do some homework and have scrutiny around what you're going to use and cross-reference that versus your source of truth, which is the RCW codes. We still do that day in and day out. Even though this is our core focus, we do this thousands of times over throughout the day. We still always want to reference back to RCW code, and just be sure that we're in compliance. So very important to, much like building your screening criteria, is build your book of forms and documents that you're going to use and make sure that you apply them all in the applicable scenarios. So there's lots of resources out there that you can pull those down from, but it's worth sitting down and really being intentional about how you build out your business when it comes to all the required documentation.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, and it's not an endless amount of documents that you need. There's some core ones you need. You need a good move out, move in, move out, what you're going to do for of course, your lease document, very important. And then all the attached disclosures and things for that. One really good recommendation is RHA of Washington. They provide a lot of really up-to-date forms for people that want to maybe self-manage. And that's a smaller investment on a yearly basis. But I think the key that I've seen with this is once you make sure that the forms that you are getting are not just boilerplate, that they are specific to the city and the state that you're working in. Some cities in Washington have different rules than other cities, and you have to make sure that you're adapting to those. And one other pitfall that I see is, we might get someone that comes in here and they'll be like, I've been using the same forms for 10 years.
Right.
And we look at these and it's just a sense of shock of, wow, these are so outdated that most of these things are illegal and you can't do any, in terms of timelines and how you have to service a process and all of this stuff is all but changed. So once you do get your updated forms, you have to, like you mentioned, make sure that you're updating those on a regular basis. And we can see the law change definitely yearly, sometimes more than that when you're talking about cities. So once you get all your forms and documents in a row, make sure that you're just updating those on a regular basis. Like I mentioned, a good option is RHA. They'll do that for you. So every time you get a new form there, it has, the appropriate updates based on the new laws that have changed. And there's been several in the past couple of years in Washington State, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. RHA is a great resource. I recommend building a habit or tapping into, a resource that is going to update you on things that do change, because when they change, they change very rapidly. And something that you may have already had in place, maybe say a pending renewal, the way that you presented that or offered that renewal might have to be, voided out and reissued based on whatever new legislation may have changed. So I think of it as, when you have your cup of coffee, whether it's an email chain or something that you subscribe to, just be sure that you're staying in touch with things that might happen, things that might change.
Yeah, it's definitely not a set it and forget it. And you brought up a good point about those renewals, because that happened to us just on a larger scale. The timelines for renewal are several months in advance that we're starting these 6 months in advance in some cases. And so we're putting out 100 renewals to all of these tenants. The law change comes in and it's retroactive.
Right.
So we need to come back and redo all of those executed renewals. And that's one thing a little unique maybe to Washington State, that they'll do it in that way. So now we're renegotiating with the tenants, doing new documentation, updated forms on stuff that was already executed. And so that's something that I think, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not intuitive. You think if the law changed, it's going to be from here going forward, but that's not necessarily the case with landlord-tenant. Sometimes the law changes are going to impact what you did in the past, and you're going to have to come back and change that. So that's really important. And there's a lot of good resources for Washington State law changes that you can subscribe to. And I think that's really good. Just making sure that you're seeing things that are coming down, seeing that things might, and then making adjustments accordingly. So important.
Sure.
So we talked about a few things I mean, to try to to encapsulate when this works well, it's typically someone that's local, so they can go out to the property and they can be really hands-on and talk to the tenants, do their periodic evaluations. One thing that I see when we do have a landlord that's maybe in trouble is they hadn't been to the property in years and years, or for a year. The rent came in, and so they hadn't gone out to the property. Well, that is really problematic. Just because a tenant is paying rent and you don't hear from them does not mean they're keeping that property in good condition. There could be all kinds of problems that you don't want to wait 2 years, a year, 2 years, 3 years before you discover. You want to deal with those before they really escalate. So making sure you're doing your periodic walkthroughs of the property documenting all of those and addressing issues in real time there. That's super important. Staying up to date on legislation, education, making sure that you know what's going on and are your processes in compliance. So important. Also having the time to dedicate to all of this is something people might not be thinking about. What I like to think about it is you need to assign yourself an hourly wage. What is your time worth? Because presumably people are doing this to save money. They're doing this because they either feel as though they can do a better job or that they want to save money from hiring a professional to do it. Well, you need to factor in, okay, if that's the case and you want to save money, what's your time worth? Because your time is valuable and this will take time, not to mention the time of just being on, making sure you're available if something happens. There's a break-in in the middle of the night, a tree falls, the sewer backs up. These things often happen on Thanksgiving,
Yes.
midnight, all kinds, just straight, definitely with us, we manage 1,000 properties. Things are happening every day. But even when you have a few properties, they're going to happen when it's really, really cold. That's often at night, or there's, situations where you're going to need to be available and act very quickly in order to stay in compliance. So those are the type of things that you got to think about and just really lean into. Absolutely, it's doable, but just knowing what you need to do when you come into it with eyes wide open, really helpful. Well, let's
Yeah.
talk about what doesn't work anymore. What has made this very challenging for we talked about my dad years ago doing this. What's not working? What risks should landlords be aware of when evaluating whether they want to do it themselves or hire a professional?
So some risks to definitely be aware of and to really evaluate if you are planning to become a self-manager for your investment property is just remembering while it is a great opportunity, thanks to all the great resources out there and all of the off-the-shelf self-management style, softwares or form creation creators, is that residents are also have that same level of resource. So tenants are able to educate themselves, and rightfully so. They absolutely should be, but they're also very, very aware of the requirements for repairs that might affect, safety and habitability. So the level of tenant, I would say, their expectation for professional management has risen most definitely, and so just presenting yourself in that very professional manner, communicating very clearly, and documenting everything is very important. So I would just say, as a part of what is a real challenge today, is just the fact that it's not just as simple as signing a lease and then getting one or two repairs done per year. It's being sure that you stay compliant, because the awareness of what is compliant is much easier to find out nowadays. And so those tenant protections are very important and can really get you in some tough situations. So something that I do see as a risk for self-manager is managing major repairs. Repairs that affect habitability, and when you can and when you cannot expect to charge rent anymore. So something called rent abatement. Devin mentioned, bad things like to happen at bad times, whether it be a holiday or in the middle of the night, the clock starts ticking immediately. So if your sewer backs up and it becomes a sewer line replacement and a remediation that's needed, those can be extremely difficult to coordinate. And the timeline and the availability of those vendors to get out and act very quickly for a self-manager may not be as proactive or aggressive as a larger property manager might have the availability to. So that can be a real struggle. And that changes the ability for you to charge rents and to keep that property occupied long term. So I would say those major repairs can be a real struggle for self-managers, and one that you want to kind of create a checklist for in the future, one that you want to be prepared for, how you're going to handle that, how you're going to document everything that takes place during those times.
Yeah, it's a little bit different than when something happens at the house that you live in. You have a lot of time to figure it out. There's not all these rules and regulations. And you've used the word document a few times, and that is so important for a landlord to document when they took action and how. What communication was given and was it received? All of these things will matter if something goes wrong and a tenant has an issue. You also mentioned that tenant have a lot of resources. Yeah, they have a lot of resources. The information is readily available to them, and also free legal advice, and especially in Seattle. So they may have attorneys working on their behalf and really knowing exactly what's required and what isn't, and looking for any missteps, except especially when things go wrong. Most of the time, if you have a really good relationship and you followed all of the rules, it's not going to be an issue. It's when things go wrong, how wrong do they go? And this kind of leads me into the next area that I wanted to talk about, and that's some of the hidden costs of self-managing and things that you need to be aware of. That, if we're taking a simple evaluation of should I manage on my own, or should I pay for a competent professional management company? Well, there's a cost for a competent professional management company. They're not going to work for free. They're going to expect, they have a lot of people that they're using to make sure that you're getting the best possible results. So you say, well, I'm going to do this on my own, and I'll be able to save that particular line item on the P&L for this property. Well, I would say, okay, that can be done if you employ some of the things that we talked about, but there's a few things that can really erode your profitability and make it so you're actually making less money than you would have had you hired a property management company. And so the first one that I can think of is not controlling your vacancy. And, we've talked about this a lot. It's something that I know you monitor with your team, is days without revenue. When you have a property, much different than when you're living in it. When you have an investment property, it only makes money when there is a tenant in this. How do you think about monitoring days without revenue and vacancy as a self-manager?
Yeah, so very important here, because again, your tenant is really your asset, right? And the relationship with your tenant and keeping that long-term tenant is so very important. So that is a metric that we track here, and I would say where we really excel at that is our processes and our preparedness ahead of time. So when we do know, when we receive notice from a tenant that they're going to be leaving the property, we want to make sure that we are communicating early and often as to what are the steps, what does your move out need to look like? Here are the requirements per your lease as to how that move out needs to happen. And even as far as beginning those showings and the marketing ahead of the last day of tenancy gives you a head start to control the days that it's vacant. So something that I believe is a benefit for a professional property manager is just the repetition, the experience that professional property managers have in handling notice to vacates, handling the move out timeline, the disposition timeline, the make ready repairs, showing the property, screening applications, presenting new leases. All of that is happens at a very crucial time when the property's not earning any money anymore. So the just processes happening congruently, happening at the same time, is where I think a professional property manager can help reduce those days of vacancy in a great way. But something you should certainly look into, how do you map that out? How do you map that stage of the property when it's coming vacant to getting it filled again as soon as possible, but with a quality tenant?
Yeah. No, I completely understand what you're talking about. I think it's super important is to have a plan and to be prepared when you are about to get a vacancy. And that just means good quality communication with your tenants. And how I see this going wrong, and I kind of try to bring this back to, are you going to save money or not? And yes, the answer is you can potentially save some money if you are very, very proactive in all of these areas we've talked about. But say, for example, it takes you a couple weeks to go through all of those things you talked about. It's gonna, you're busy and it's taking you a while to go do the move out. And then you need to find somebody to do the repairs. And then after that, okay, now I'm going to start going out there and taking some pictures now that it's done. Okay, now I'm going to start showing tenants, but I can't show them today. So maybe it takes you an extra 3 weeks to get the property on the market. Well, now you're looking at 1 month of vacancy is 8% of your gross revenue. Well, a property management company is going to charge you between 8% and 10% per year, maybe a little bit more with leasing fees, but you've already eaten up a huge amount of your profit just by those small delays. So the sooner you can get out there and get the property filled, the more money you make. And that requires a lot of steps, like you mentioned. And so here, just us as an example, we might have 5 people working together on all of these things, doing the disposition, negotiating with the tenant, having repairs go in there, getting the marketing done, starting to do the showings. All of this is happening at the same time. And if you're a self-manager, there's just a party of one. You're responsible for getting all of that done very, very quickly. So not only is that going to take your time, which you should be billing for or thinking about at least, but also you just need to do it very effectively. Having a solid plan really helps impact that. And I'd say that's the number one hidden cost that owners don't think about is unless I'm very proactive, I'm going to incur some vacancy. Well, that time is money in rentals, and they can easily eat up any potential cost savings that they thought they were going to get, but because that property wasn't filled with an income producing tenant quickly. So that's a really big one.
And I
Other
think,
ones come.
oh, I'm sorry. Just to note, you've mentioned putting a number on your time as a self manager. So not only is it the investment of your time, your sweat equity going back into the property, but it's also the mental fatigue of it can often take dozens of showings before you receive an application, depending on the condition of the property, the price point that you list it at. So that's just a repeated investment of time before you get an application, and then the likelihood that that application is approved, and having to redo those same things. So I think real estate is definitely a sexy venture, and it's one that it's a great investment. But I think just certainly be aware of the time that you're going to invest, but also what it takes time away from, and really just the fatigue that it can create when you're having to do all of those as a one person show.
Yeah, it definitely takes a certain personality that's comfortable with that, but comes in with eyes wide open. And, so we've talked about how vacancy on the front end or on terms can cost you. There's some things you can do upstream to help prevent this. So another risk that they find is if you are not proactive in your maintenance and very responsive in your maintenance, you're going to have tenants that are unhappy. And unhappy tenants start to get very nitpicky. They start to have problems with a lot more things. And the first time they get to move out, they're going to. And so when I'm thinking about how do I keep my property in creating the most money possible, the most profitable is profitable as possible, it is really being very responsive to maintenance requests and communicative with tenants. When something goes wrong in a tenant's world at their home, rightly so, it's a big deal. When their refrigerator stops working, or their toilet backs up and can't be flushed. Those are big deals. This is their home. And you have to be very responsive, not only because there are some laws associated with that, but you're going to see that unhappy tenants are going to move out. You're going to have more turnover, which is there's a lot of costs in turning a property over, and you're going to increase that vacancy. One thing, and we were just talking about this week, Duncan, is the expectations of owners during turnover. We'll have some owners that believe that all of the turnover costs should be shouldered by the tenants. And unfortunately, well, that's just not the case. There are some that we can attribute to tenants, But a lot of the things that need to be done to keep an investment property in great shape and running well, those are going to be have to be built into the owner's budget and an owner's cost.
Yes, absolutely. Everything has an expected lifespan. And I think it can be a shock, especially if it transitions from your home, your personal home, to an investment property. I think it can be a shock that, certain things have worn out over 1 to 5 years, however long you might have that tenant. But it does not mean that a remodel is the burden of the tenant. Tenants are very well protected against that. You must be conservative in what is or is not charged against a tenant's deposit. And it all has to be verified. It all has to be proven. Your move-in checklist prior to the first day of their lease, agreeing on the condition, your move-out checklist, comparing before and after. All of those are extremely important. So you must assume some of that cost at turn, and you can't just kind of rinse and repeat your property and put a new tenant in there. You have to go in there, do touch-up paint, change flooring, do some landscaping, things that are going to attract your next high-quality tenant and reduce your vacancy long term.
And I see, a lot of owners saying, well, the carpet was in great condition when I was there. I know it's 10 years old, but we kept it really nice. And the courts don't look at it like that. They're going to
Right.
say, well, what's the useful life of these things? What's the useful life of a carpet? If it's past that, they may very well find that you can't charge the tenant.
Mhm.
And I've been to over doing this for 16, 18 years, and then also growing up, I've been to many small claims where the courts have ruled in the tenant's favor. We're very tenant friendly state here, and they're going to err on the side of the person without the perceived power. And that's going to be the residents.
Mhm.
And so owners going to have to understand that if they make charges that they can't back up, they're going to end up losing a lot more than they thought they were going to. And that's sort of a hidden cost there for sure. I think one more hidden cost, but before we move on to where property management might be right for you, is liability and understanding that to be the manager, you're taking on a certain aspect of liability and being very aware of that. So we talked about it briefly. Are you sending in licensed and insured vendors, or are you trying to do the work yourself or hire someone that's not properly licensed? A lot of liability associated with that. You need to be aware of that. Did you screen your tenant properly, or they're going to have a fair housing complaint against you? A lot of liability, attorney's costs associated with that as well. Have you done your repairs within the prescribed time period set forth by the landlord tenant, by Washington State? Again, more liability. So any of these things, if something happens, can easily eat up all of your profits. And that's not to scare you. It's just to say you need to be aware of them and you have to take appropriate precautions. And it's sort of a hidden cost. Things may have been going for very well for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden you're out of compliance. You lose maybe a potential lawsuit, or you lose a tenant that starts not paying rent because of these things. That because your money comes from a good tenant paying rent on time, when that stops happening, you can lose $1,000 very quickly, $2,000, $3,000 very quickly, and that eats up those profits pretty substantially. Just
Yeah.
things to be thinking about.
Yep.
Nice. I love to. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just hidden costs, but hidden risk as well. Things that
Yeah.
may seem very, conversational or lighthearted with a tenant or resident of your property could very well be, under the letter of the law, a reasonable accommodation. And those are things that very quickly can get landlords in trouble. If a resident is asking for an accommodation based on a personal need, or potentially disability, you have to consider those and have to go down a path as to who's going to take care of those at what cost, who's ultimately responsible for them. So again, things that if you don't speak the language, you may not recognize the gravity of a request or of a conversation.
Yeah. And don't get me started on pets, service animals, and emotional support animals. There's a whole
Right.
nother area of law. And pitfalls in that. That's maybe for for another session here, because we could go on about that for an hour. But yeah, that's definitely another one that you need to be really careful of, and make sure that you're thinking about accommodations, for reasonable accommodations in the beginning when that comes up, for sure. So to kind of close this out, so say someone's listening to this and they're going, I definitely could do this. I have the ability, but I just don't have the want to. I don't want to be monitoring laws. I don't want to be the direct source for my tenant if anything goes wrong. So who would fit best with a professional property management service?
Yeah, to me, I think of, again, do you enjoy the time investment? Do you really enjoy, contract language and dispute resolution and, handiwork and major repairs? If you enjoy that, I think it's great. There's real opportunity in being a self-manager. For somebody who is very busy with personal or professional life, and this is kind of more of a side project, I would absolutely recommend a professional property manager for the peace of mind. Somebody who is going to answer the phone call 24/7 and have vendors in the wings ready to go out and inspect and repair. So somebody who just doesn't want to have that burden or the weight over them of what might be happening at my property. You can absolutely curve that with a professional property manager, and do your homework too. Not every property manager is right for every owner and how involved they
Mhm.
want to be. So definitely important to get to know, who you might be handing your property to, and, understand how their processes work, how their teams are built. And there's lots of great options out there. So I think if you're willing to take a little bit of cost for professional service, then it's certainly worth it for your peace of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I see when in doing this for so long, I see some people that I definitely recommend to be self-managers, and those are the ones that want to know every single detail about what's going on at the property. They want to meet the tenants. They want to keep doing tours of the property themselves. They want to be involved in every maintenance request. And I'm saying to themselves, it doesn't work to have two people managing that property, a property management company and the owner at the same time. There's going to be conflict. It's going to go outside that property manager's services and how they want to operate effectively. And those people, I would say, I can tell that you love this property. It's very important to you to be involved in all the details. Why don't you go to sign up with a self-managing service where you can get all the appropriate documents and stay in this, because I can tell you're not going to want to hand this off.
Mhm.
I think our target clients, the people that come to SJA, are the opposite of that. They are the ones that they either don't want to be involved at all. It's SJA, I want you to get me these results. And I hired you because you are good at getting me these results. I want the most money over the long term. I want the property well maintained. I want my risks really reduced. And I'm willing to pay you fairly to do that for me, because I know in the end I'm going to end up making more money than I would on my own, because I'm just not dedicated enough and willing to put in that part-time job. We also have people that think about it from a building wealth standpoint. And I'm one of those people with real estate. Is if I continue to self-manage, it's going to eventually, I'm going to tap out in terms of my amount of time that I can manage if I keep adding properties. So we have several investors that have many properties with us, and they understand that they need to have a good team around them so that they can keep adding to their portfolio and really perfecting what they do, which often is identifying markets to invest in, finding the right financing, getting the right property, and then handing it off to our team. That works really well. So they can be more passive and not actively involved in each investment. I think we're all like the people that are in real estate, we really like it. It's a nice diversification. There's great tax benefits. You can get great multipliers on your invested capital, but you want to make sure that it's not going to take up so much time and be so stressful for you. There is that aspect of, is owning more property is going to add more stress to my life, even if it might be a good long-term investment. I think going with a really quality management company can help take a lot of that stress away. So those are our takeaways. I hope everyone has found this valuable. There's a lot. This is a big topic, but I think there's some key takeaways that you can take and say what's right for you. We're always happy to chat with you. We have no obligation consultations. Talk to Alana from our team. She'll go over the ins and outs, how we operate, what we do, what we take off your plate, and you can decide for yourself what makes the most sense. And of course, there's other property management resources out there. Like Duncan said, they're not all equal. You want to definitely do your homework to the ones that are going to get you those best possible results long term. But Duncan, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Devin. Enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks so much.